4 people, 1 hour, 15 minutes. So if we stick to the 10 minutes, we have a lot of time for discussion, and I think that would be very appreciated. I want to start off with Professor Philip McCann from the University of Sheffield. He's been one of the main researchers in the project, and he will present, I think, some of the results which were published before, but were also known in some of the media. Phil, do you have a microphone?
Well, hello everybody. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just present some aspects of the work of our research team, which, as Raquel has already explained, is a large team, and quite a few members of our team here from different universities will be presenting at different points. The issues I'm going to talk about, Jonathan Portes has already alluded to them in terms of how we're thinking about these issues. So it's one particular way of thinking about the potential implications of Brexit on different parts of the UK, and we're looking at regions, we're looking at sectors, we're looking at occupational and skills groups. There's different ways of cutting the cake. So these are things which, as Frank van Oort just said, these are things which are already published. They're out in the public domain, and as Raquel has also already indicated, they've had huge exposure in terms of the media, both in the UK and also in other countries, and also within the academic world. So we're just going to try and tell you basically the line of argument. One of the big issues that you often hear is that we hear all these discussions about trade surpluses and trade balances. We've got a trade deficit with Europe, therefore they're going to be very keen to do a good deal with us, this kind of narrative. This is based on a logic called mercantilism. Mercantilism disappeared in the middle of the 19th century as a result of the Corn Law debates. And it's not taught in a single economics course anywhere in the world. It's sort of resurfaced in history, in linguistics and political sciences recently, and particularly in the Brexit debates, and it's extremely influential. You hear these arguments all the time. Analytically, it's total nonsense. The reason is this, because you can't say, well, we export financial services, the French sell us wine and the Italians sell us Prosecco, that's how trade works. No. So the kind of examples I would give to my students, if I think about an engineering company in the West Midlands, 3 or 4 generations of automobile subcomponents manufacturers. What do? They get a contract from Toyota or Jaguar Land Rover. They don't go to the financial markets in London to get contracts to get financial services. They go to local financial suppliers who've worked with the auto industry for decades. They know all the technologies. They know their investment patterns. They work with the local financial specialists who specialize in auto engineering, who then work with the local lawyers who also specialize in the technology related to the auto engineering. To get a project, a program, they work with intellectual property rights lawyers and so on to get all the technologies up and running. What do? They develop those technologies, which then are sent to Italy to work on a joint venture, which then go to France to a collaborative scheme, which is then sent to Denmark to some sort of sub-assemblies that come back to the UK, and then they're sent back to Germany, embodied in a German car, which is exported back to the UK. That's what value chains look like. The distinction between sectors becomes completely blurred because it's in a value chain, goods and services, and going forwards and backwards across borders multiple times and across sectoral boundaries. What is a service in something like that? It's very hard to define it. What's a manufactured component when all those service inputs are embodied? So if you add up exports and imports, what you're doing is you're adding up exports and re-exports and imports and re-imports. What you're doing is giving a description of how deconstructed is the value chain across borders. You can't say anything by looking at the trade surplus or the trade deficit. It just doesn't have, basically has almost no meaning in international trade theory. What you've got to do is you've got to work out what is the value added in your exports, controlling for all those flows of goods and services forwards and backwards across borders and across sectoral boundaries. And this is what we do here. We use the data sets that were built by teams of people led by Dr. Mark Thiessen over here and Professor Bart Loss, who's not able to join us today. These are enormous data building exercises. I think we worked out there was around 15, 20 person years of data building involved in putting these data sets together. And what we do is we build data sets which allow us to work out what these value-added contributions are. And it's based on, the original argument is Koopman, Wang and Wang in the American Economic Review, which explains in this reality how you understand the real value added in trade. How much is trade related to domestic economic value added? It's extremely complex mathematically, but if you have trade and input-output data, which is the internal structure of each economy, sector by sector, activity by activity, linked to trade flows sector by sector, and also country by country, you link all of these together, then you have a direct analogy to calculate these things. And that was also shown by a paper in the American Economic Review by one of our team, Bart Loss and his colleagues. So what we do is we basically use this to calculate the exposure of different parts of the UK to Brexit. And we use the term exposure very specifically. It's the sense that David O'Toole uses it in terms of the exposure of different parts of the US to China, the competition that different parts of China have for different sectors, industries, regions in the US. That's the notion of exposure we use. Now, the way it works is this. So look at the trade structure today. You've got things moving forwards and backwards. Now, imagine Brexit happens and something goes wrong at the last minute. Suddenly everything stops. Let's imagine there's a last-minute chaotic situation and basically there's a wall suddenly comes up around the UK, or the drawbridge comes up. In order to calculate the value added in exports, you have to calculate the difference between that and that. It's got nothing to do with Brexit. That's actually how you have to model the trade flows to understand what the real value added contribution is. Ironically, it's the worst imaginable Brexit scenario, but it's actually the only way to identify the exposure of regions and sectors to a situation such as Brexit by calculating the value added in exports. So we're not modeling the no-deal scenario, just ironically, in a sense, it gives you that result, but we don't include the things that Jonathan was talking about, such as labour market effects, human capital flows. We don't include additional issues on foreign direct investment or having to negotiate 759 other trade agreements. We don't include any of those things. We just look at the pure trade effects. And what do we see? Well, we talk about implications, not impacts. We're not saying this is going to be the impact. What we're saying, the implications are the level of exposure you have to Brexit is an index of how much your economy locally is going to have to restructure itself to try to respond to the post-Brexit realities. That's how to think about it. How big is the mountain you're going to have to climb? How steep is the slope? These are what the results look like, so in map form. So the results of the UK, all UK regions have exposure levels between about 10% and 17%. The lowest is the north of Scotland, northeast Scotland, which is around 9.5%, followed by the London, inner London, and outer London, which are about 10%. The highest exposure levels are in the Midlands and the north of England. They're around 16, 17% of GDP. And people might say, well, is that a big number or a small number? Well, if you think about the contractions associated with the global financial crisis, in most countries we're typically about 3%. So it gives you a sense of what the kind of scale of the numbers we're talking about in terms of how to understand exposure. The next most exposed country is the Republic of Ireland, which is exposed around 10% of its GDP, direct exposure. And then after that, it's really the rest of Europe, the exposure levels are much lower. The next most exposed country is Germany, followed by the Netherlands and Belgium. But the orders of magnitude are so much lower. The most exposed places in Europe are the regions of the Midlands and the north of England. That's what we find, followed by the Scottish regions and then London. So if we take the UK out because the exposure levels are so high, then on the right-hand side, what you see is the rest of Europe. So Republic of Ireland is most exposed, followed by the western and southern regions of Germany. Why? Because of all the value supply chains, things like auto industries, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. But it's not just those industries, it's also all the service inputs on both sides of the channel, which are embodied in all those activities. The exposure levels of the western and the southern German regions we calculate are about 6%, 5 and 6%. In the case of the Netherlands, the regions are about 4%. The Belgian regions are 3.5%. The French regions are 2.5%, about 2.2% and below. And then the rest of Europe, if you look at all the Mediterranean countries, Central and Eastern Europe and Nordic Europe, all the exposure levels are less than 1% of GDP. More than 2/3 of the countries in Europe, and you think about the voting rules in the Council, for example, more than 2/3 of the countries in Europe have exposure levels to Brexit of less than 1% of their GDP. It's the opposite of the trade deficit argument. Completely the opposite. And we get the same results or similar results looking at labour income shares. Of course, they differ between regions because of capital intensity, different types of industries, different types of activities, but we get broadly the same results, as you can see. And these are the numbers again, as I said, the types of exposure levels. What we see is the UK is 4.6 times more exposed than the EU, than the rest of the EU. 4.6 times more exposed. Again, it's the opposite of the trade deficit argument, trade surplus argument, completely opposite. And then the final part that we present here is just briefly, we also do the same thing for sectors. So it's not on a regional level, it's at a national level, but we look at the exposure levels of sectors. And I think that's important for today, because what we find is that many of the most exposed sectors are service industries which are hidden. Look at all the service industries up here, and these are total numbers of people directly exposed. So administrative and support services, about 500,000 jobs, are directly exposed, and their share, the relative exposure of these industries is extremely high. And of course, many of these industries are the ones involved in all these value chain activities. You look at them here, legal and accounting services, activities auxiliary to financial services, exactly Jonathan's point. Professional and technical activities, computer programming, consulting, and so on. Of course, the other aspect that we find is it's also, these are industries with high productivity levels. On average, they're higher skilled and higher productivity, and they're the most vulnerable. So if you take the case of financial services as people would think about it more classically, the kind of city, the exposure levels in terms of international financial services are actually, we find, very low, about 8 to 9%, which is more or less exactly what the Financial Times finds. It's not those that are exposed, it's all the auxiliary activities in service industries which are inputting into the big service exporting sectors, but also into all the big manufacturing exporters. It's all of those industries which don't have a great deal of profile in the press or political representation. We have Richard Chaplin here from the Managing Partners Association. We find that these sectors are the most exposed. And interestingly, if you look at the difference between service industries and manufacturing, exposure levels at an industry level for manufacturing in the UK are typically 40, 50% levels of exposure, extraordinarily high. Whereas service industries, their exposure levels tend to be only around 7 or 8%. But, of course, that's because many service industries are entirely local real estate services, for example, and also because the share of the services in the economy is so big, about 77, 78% of the UK GDP is service industries. Even though their exposure levels are much lower, the absolute levels of exposure of service industries are actually slightly higher than manufacturing industries. But it's for these hidden reasons of global value chains. So it's quite a different story than many people think. So we calculate that in terms of the overall, about 2.5 million jobs, almost exactly, are directly exposed to Brexit, which in today's money accounts for about 140 billion in terms of current activity annually. So these are very large numbers. And as I say, these kind of professional, scientific, technical activities, high human capital, the kind of activities that economies like many of our cities operate on, but are also these kind of supply chain things that are very, very hidden. And so we know that many primary and manufacturing sectors are very exposed, but that only tells part of a much broader and more complicated story, that it's these services, many of which are not directly exported, that's the point as well, but they feed into supply chains which then drive exports. So it's a much it's a more complex reality than many of our discussions. And as I say, these on average are slightly more productive. So that's also an issue when you think about the productivity challenges that the UK faces. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Phil. Just in time before I was going to protest, so that's very good. I suggest we go on with the other presenters and still hope to have some time left, because I can imagine this also raises some questions, quite some figures coming here to the table. So I want to invite Dr. Ben Gardner, Cambridge Econometrics, to say his. Do you have a microphone? Okay, please go ahead.
Thanks, thanks, Frank, and also thanks to Raquel and Phil and others in the team for inviting me here. I don't have any slides, so you just have to listen to me talk for a little bit. That's hopefully fine. What I'm talking about here is the study that we did for the Greater London Authority, London Mayor's Office, which was called Preparing for Brexit. Although you may be, a little anecdote, you may be interested to know, originally it was called The Impact on London's Economy of a Hard Brexit. They decided that that was a little bit too extreme, possibly, although I think with hindsight, I think it should have probably been called Waiting for Brexit, because firstly, it's a bit of a tragicomedy kind of thing, the whole process, and secondly, we may be kind of ultimately doing all this work for something that never actually arrives. But nonetheless, what I'll do is give you a brief context, scope of the study, what we did, main messages, and then actually on reflection, because the work finished by kind of January, just my further thoughts on all of this as I've observed other things going on. So the context and scope of the study, it wasn't an academic study. It was very short time frame, 3 months of work from October to December. So we haven't had didn't have the degree of resources and time and effort that the ESRC funded work has had, which is great, obviously. And this meant, given the time frame and also given the desire for the GLA to know specifics about soft and hard Brexits, in other words, they wanted to know the impact of price effects, of migration, of investment, of everything that Brexit could possibly affect. We couldn't do the kind of thing that Phil and his team are doing, because that is another way of looking at risks and kind of exposure. And the other problem is that there is no single model, economic model, that will do all of that for you. There is no model that will do all the global effects, bring them to national, and then bring them to local. It simply doesn't exist. It's a too complex a system. So what we had to do was to combine a kind of global, national, sectoral modeling system with a more localized approach, which kind of combined the price, investment, migration effects in a top-down way. Again, in discussion with the client, with the GLA, we developed a set of scenarios, of kind of baseline, which was largely go as we are, a couple of intermediate soft Brexit scenarios, which involved kind of variations of the single market membership and customs union, which generally mean just increasing levels of non-tariff barriers. And then also a kind of final scenario, which was more or less WTO rules, hence kind of tariff and non-tariff barriers. What we were also able to do, because of the nature of the modeling that we were doing, was we could also model transition effects as well. So we could have like a 2-year no effect, and then see what difference that made versus the kind of immediate kind of cliff edge type of scenario. Okay. So we had our kind of global sectoral model, which is called E3ME. You can read all about it in the report that we did for the GLA, and this allowed us to make assumptions for the trade prices, allowed us to make assumptions for investment, including FDI, although that was off-model to some extent, and also for migration and population. Again, slightly off-model, and also the links between migration and skilled labour and productivity was also had to be done largely by assumption. And what you find is when you look at most other models and macro models that are doing this kind of work, they also do those kind of things as well, particularly if they're involving sectoral stuff. So there's only a core amount that any economic model can do. The rest has to be kind of a little bit kind of on the side and then added in later. The assumptions for trade, we used an existing model, the LSE approach. They'd done a paper a few months before, which we found very helpful, so we made use of that. Investment, we were using uncertainty effects, which were already present in the data, linking that in with our model of the trade effects, and also FDI, as I said. Migration was tricky because how do you model net migration as a target with a hard Brexit of 100,000 or under 100,000? It's impossible. So we had to make judgments on that. Localizing was largely a top-down process using our local area employment and GVA data. So this allowed us to some extent, apportion the national sector results. But we also went beyond that as well and looked at the relative performance of London and London sectors and also boroughs within London relative to the UK economy, which allowed us to kind of allow a kind of deviation in performance there to see what effect Brexit might have. Okay. The results ranged from, for London, approximately 4 billion in GVA by 2030 for the kind of softest Brexit, to 11 billion for the hardest version of Brexit, and that was associated with about 30,000 people employed less in the softest Brexit versus 90,000 less in the hardest Brexit. We were also able to produce other results as well, but those were the kind of headline numbers which caught the press at the time. The other kind of things that we looked at were London's position relative to the UK. Generally speaking, we found London wasn't expected to be affected as much as the UK in terms of GVA and productivity because of some of the higher value activities that are involved with, which makes it a little bit more resilient, but less so on population and employment because, again, London benefits from the more openness and migration effects for its workforce. So key points that we found, we've already repeated some of them for London. We obviously found, as everybody has, the harder the Brexit, the bigger the hit when it comes to the effects on employment, productivity, GVA, and so on. Due to the effects on investment and migration, we're talking about permanent effects here. We're not talking about an initial shock which then comes back to a kind of another trajectory that was there before. It is going to have a permanent growth effect as well as a levels effect on employment, GVA, and so on. The financial services, professional services, science and technology, creative sectors, they are among the hardest hit. That comes out through the general sector effects. But for London, less so than the rest of the UK, again, because of the kind of resilience analysis that we did. But sectors such as construction and hospitality, which rely more on the kind of lower skilled areas and are more hit by the population side of things, do end up worse in London than elsewhere. Lastly, last kind of thoughts on further thoughts of this. As I said, there is no all singing, all dancing modelling approach to this, but I do think that different approaches like Phil's, our own, and other modellers do have a role to play in providing insights for this. Secondly, Brexit isn't just a long-run phenomenon. Economists like to think about the long run, but there are short-run effects which are already taking place. There are anticipation effects for investment, there are migration effects already available in the data, inflation and so on, and these should be part of a modelling approach. It shouldn't just be about looking at the long run, we should actually be thinking about short-run impacts too. Thirdly, resilience should be considered here. By which I mean the ability of places to absorb shocks and or rebound quickly, okay? And there are various factors, work I've done with Ron Martin in Cambridge, which affects the ability of a place to rebound, such as history, culture, psychology of a place, entrepreneurship, governance, functions and nature of the supply chain linkages. All of this stuff, economic models don't do very well. The last one Phil's done very well with his model, but the others, they don't do particularly well. And these are things we still need to look at and research. And that leads me on to a final point, really, which is if you really want to capture the effects of Brexit on place, top-down models aren't sufficient. You've really got to go bottom-up and look at the nature of the place, how it works, how it relates to other places and other sectors, and do a proper job that way. You can touch the surface of it by doing top-down, but you really need to go bottom-up to get a proper impact. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. Happy to see that many skilled hands are getting around all this complexity, and that you still have also a research agenda. So that's, of course, very well. I want to go over to the next person, Mr. Carter for Centre for Cities. And please take your time.
Thank you very much. So I think in terms of the economics of the impact of Brexit, in a sense, everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. So I'm not going to say anything on the economics. We can debate the discussions. I think there's an observation and an acceptance that whatever form of Brexit that we have, whether we're talking about London or we're talking about our other cities across the UK, it's a negative experience, right? We're going to debate the degrees of negativity, but certainly in the short, medium run, we are discussing and debating degrees of negativity rather than the sunny uplands that we would others would like us to focus on. So I'm going to just accept that and agree with that. Our work tells us something very similar, and then say something about the politics and the policy of that sort of question and issue. And I think there's always something interesting about when we discuss the role and the significance of London Jonathan alluded to this, because it is extraordinarily important to the national economy. We're talking somewheres between 20 and 25% of the national economy when we're talking about output. In London, we're talking about somewheres around a third of the national tax take comes out of London into the for the rest of the country. In a sense, and for some comparison, when you look at other big cities like West Midlands or Greater Manchester, those numbers, comparative numbers, are about 4%, right? So when we talk about London, we're always in this kind of peculiar set of circumstances where there's a national conversation going on, and that can be good and bad in the sense that central government is rarely far away from issues that relate to London. And in some instances, it certainly squeezes out the London-specific conversation about what's right for London, because national government cannot leave London alone in the sense it's too significantly important at the national level for all manner of different things. So I think that's a peculiar circumstance that is different if you go and talk to and have a conversation about Greater Manchester or West Midlands or Greater Leeds or whatever. They are important, but in the scale of things, they are nowhere near as important as London is in the national context. I think the other point, again, as I said, been said by others, Jonathan alluded to this in his opening comments, there is enormous difference on a whole range of economic indicators between what London is doing and producing and what other places are doing. And it's by far the most stark when we look across the European Union. So enormous difference within the country. That is most definitely true. Interestingly, though, I think when Jonathan said, what London needs or wants from a policy response to Brexit may well be different from the rest of the UK. That's partly true, but clearly, obviously, there are similarities in the terms of the policy agenda that London desires that other big cities or other cities also want. In a sense, Greater Manchester also wants a policy response that enables and supports its economy to expand. It doesn't want to be shut off from international flows of trade or migration or innovation and all the rest of it. So there is a partial difference, but actually there is a partial similarity, I think, because our other cities also need and want from a post-Brexit situation similar things that London particularly wants. And I think that does raise interesting questions, which we now see in the country, particularly in England, about the future political structure of England. In a sense, this is partly an explanatory issue when we look at, outside of London, the rise of the metro mayors over the last 12 to 18 months. In a sense, our other big cities, Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Greater Liverpool, etc., 7 places outside of London, now acquiring their own metro mayor, which is similar but slightly different from what we see in London. A demand, in part because of Brexit, for these places to have the political structures that allow them to take more autonomy and control over the issues that really matter to those. And indeed, within London, you hear this daily from the mayor and from colleagues in and around London governance, them also requiring or requesting further powers and responsibilities over issues, whether it's skills or whether it's suburban rail, or whether it's finance questions. So you can see, I think, in part, the political policy response is this rise to deal with the England question, which is too big, England, too controlled by national government, not sufficient autonomy and responsibility at a scale that makes sense to the everyday geography the geography of everyday life. And I think my final reflection would be, which we can debate, what's for certain happened for Brexit, and apologies to colleagues in the room from the civil service, is not a comment about them, but Brexit most definitely has had a paralysing effect on domestic policy, right? A paralysing effect on domestic policy in this country. Whether you think about industrial strategy, as was launched, very little progress in real terms in regards to that. If you think about FE and skills, very little progress made over the last 12 months in thinking about how we move forward on that. Very, very little, in fact, no progress on issues in relation to how we fund and finance local government and the future of property taxation and business rates taxation. No progress at all on those sorts of things, and no progress on things like social care, which weigh heavily on local government and on localities in order to deal with. All of those things, not because our civil servants are not dedicated to doing that, but political mindsets at the national level are elsewhere. So in a sense, it's had a paralysing effect. And my suggestion is, because of the reasons that we see when we look at the economic performance and the economic scenarios into the future, that cannot last. In a sense, we cannot have a paralysing effect that plays on into Brexit, either whether it does or doesn't happen, but into the next 5, 10, God only knows how many years. We cannot have that paralysing effect. So thinking about how we get that political autonomy out and away from national government and into those places, particularly on domestic policy agenda issues, is a direct outcome and a factor that will influence the nature of the response that we have to Brexit.
Thank you very much for these very clear statements. Last speaker, Mrs. Angelica Bardolai, I hope I pronounced it well. City UK, to my best knowledge, an organization focusing on financial services and research on that. So the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you for that, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be here. Actually, part of my remit at the City UK is leading our engagement with leading academic institutions. So I was particularly happy to be able to accept the invitation to be here and take part in this discussion today. Yes, thank you for flagging the work of the City UK. So just quickly, for those who may not be familiar with it, it is the membership organisation that represents the UK-based financial and related professional services industry. And we include in that, so financial services is the whole spectrum of finance. So it's, yes, banking, but also asset management, insurance, the exchanges and so on. And the related professional services, we include legal, accounting, and also management consulting. And so based on that quick introduction, you'll probably be unsurprised to hear that my brief remarks are going to be from a somewhat different angle from what you've heard from the rest of the panel. I am, of course, going to be taking a sectoral view and looking a little bit more holistically at this question, but from the point of view of the industry that I work with and that the City UK represents. So I thought I'd start off with just a very quick contextual look at some of the data. Completely agree with what we heard earlier, that looking at gross trade flows can be a somewhat oversimplified and potentially misleading picture. But nevertheless, I think just to, as a sort of almost quick and dirty way of getting a sense and some perspective, I think it's still useful, particularly when you look at trade flows as, one indicator of basically international competitiveness, which is something that we focus on a lot in our work. So these data obviously show financial services trade balances. The UK has the world's largest trade surplus in financial services. The total trade surplus was around £70 billion in 2016. And of course, that helps to offset the roughly £120 billion merchandise trade deficit, and so overall it provides support to the balance of payments position. You can see here that the EU accounts for around 40% of the financial services trade surplus. And then when you look at the second pie chart and you see the geographical breakdown, within that roughly 40% accounted for by the EU, the most prominent countries are France, Germany, and the Netherlands, which is interesting because I think, if I recall rightly, those were also some of the countries that came up in your presentation when you look at the sort of regional impacts. Not suggesting there's causality there, this is obviously different, but possibly some correlation. But anyway. Overall, you see as well that the biggest single contributor to the industry's trade surplus is the US. And although what I've put on the slide is the trade balance, if you look at the export data, the picture is almost identical. The US is the single largest destination for financial services exports, and the US is followed by France and Germany. And when you look at the export data in aggregate, what's actually striking is how geographically concentrated it is. So the top 5 export destinations for UK financial services exports, which is US, France, Germany, plus the Netherlands and Japan, those 5 countries account for about 50% of the industry's total exports. So that is, of course, all UK-wide data, but what I also wanted to do is share some analysis that we published in February. So this is part of our suite of regional work and regional analysis. And what we did was, in February, we published for the first time research that looks at financial and related professional services exports from the different regions and nations of the UK. And we were able to do this building on some new data that the ONS is doing, because they have an entire very extensive program of enhancing their subnational economic data. We've actually consulted with them on this, so obviously we were very pleased with the publication of the new data series. So we built on this to produce estimates and analysis in this report from February, and this is just sort of the summary snapshot. And what you can see here for the context of this panel discussion is that most unsurprisingly, London is at the top of this list. It accounts for around 50% of UK financial and related professional services exports. So one very rough conclusion that you could draw from this is that London and the Southeast, which is also second on the list here, are possibly relatively more exposed to potential disruption in financial services trade from Brexit than some of the other regions. I mean, that's one very quick, rough conclusion you could draw from looking at this table. I would add that there are, of course, other ways to look at it. In context to the broader services economy, the picture does look slightly different. So when you look elsewhere in the report, we looked at financial and related professional services exports as a percentage of total services exports by region. And there, of course, because of the diversity of the economy in London and the Southeast, London's ranking, if you like, is quite a bit lower. So speaking of this idea of disruption, one of the big questions that we are always asked is, what is the impact of Brexit going to be on the industry? And to answer this question, we actually worked with one of our members, Oliver Wyman, the consultancy. So we sort of commissioned work from them to try and do a quantitative assessment of this very question. So they did some quite detailed quant impact assessment work for us. And just to summarize, what they've done and the findings, the first step, which is sort of represented here, was to establish a fact base that quantifies the UK-based financial services industry. And the metrics that they used were revenue pools for the industry, and then also the macro metrics of GVA, the tax contribution, and employment, which are also metrics that we consistently look at in our own work. So obviously, we kind of made sure that those were all aligned with our existing work. And then the next step was basically a segmentation of those revenues. And so the analysis showed that of the roughly £200 billion of annual financial services revenues, it turned out that around 45 or 50% of that was domestic business earned from UK clients, and obviously the conclusion there was that that's a chunk of revenue that was not considered to be at significant risk from Brexit under any of the scenarios that were modelled, which I'll come to in a minute. Another 25% was revenues that were from international and wholesale business not related to the EU. And then another 25% or so was international business that was directly related to the EU. And so then ultimately, that segmentation was then used to estimate the impact on the industry under 2 different Brexit scenarios, which, for short, we basically describe them as high access and low access. And in the high access scenario, it was essentially that the UK would receive full equivalence and passporting across the full scope of European single market directives. And in the low access scenario, it was quite the opposite. That envisioned that the UK would revert to what's known as third country regime status, with no preferential access, so no equivalence across the core single market directives. And also it seemed that no new access arrangements would be negotiated on a bilateral basis. And of course, unsurprisingly, the bottom line here, I think I quite like the way you put it, the harder the Brexit, the bigger the hit. That is pretty much what this analysis found as well. Just to put some numbers on it, the analysis was that under the high access scenario, the industry would see revenue losses of around 1% and job losses also of around 1%. And in the low access scenario, it was revenue losses of around 10% and job losses of around 3%. And those numbers that I just gave you are the ones that are represented here on the slide by the blue icons. So that's basically the direct impact. But the analysis also looked at what we called the ecosystem impact, which is what you see represented by the gray icons. And that really represents the wider impact, including some of the indirect effects. And I think, the takeaway there, again, reinforcing this point, is that under the high access scenario, you see very little of that wider ecosystem impact, but under the low access scenario, you can see this considerable additional impact, meaning that obviously the overall Brexit effect would be much larger. So in our work program, we've done quite a bit of other work that's Brexit focused as well, but I think a lot of it is a little bit outside the scope of this discussion. A lot of it is in the policy and the regulation sphere, looking, for example, at how Brexit might change the UK's regulatory architecture. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there, and obviously we can pick up points further in discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's... This leaves us quite some room for discussion, which is, I think, a good thing. The first presentation started off quite carefully with formulating it in exposure terms. The last presentation talks in impact terms, and between exposure and impact, there's probably quite something going on. So I like policy and like a lot of other things we heard. You walk around with a microphone, I guess, because you want my microphone? Okay, who can I give the floor for questions, remarks, reactions?
Just to kick off, I'd like to pick up on some of Andrew's remarks about devolution and the appetite of English city regions for more influence, and I guess trying to put that in the context of the constitutional architecture of the UK more generally. There's been a very long-standing critique of the over-centralisation of the UK. I can think 30 years ago, David Marquand wrote a book called The Unprincipled Society, where essentially he seemed to be blaming the relatively poor economic performance of the UK significantly on its political institutions, on its adversarial political system, and so on. And I guess my concern about devolution within England is that, like devolution to the other nations and jurisdictions of the UK, it seems to be taking place on a sort of ad hoc, asymmetric, uneven basis. You could say that the tendency over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe longer, has been, for example, for education to be taken out of local control and more governed by England-wide structures. Health seems to be one of the things that's being handed back to cities where those kind of regional things are happening. It's not clear to me that that would be the optimal allocation of responsibilities if what you were trying to do is give levers of economic control back to, or give it for the first time to cities and regions. And I guess my observation, being based at Cardiff University and thinking about national and jurisdictional devolution, is that the structures and processes for connecting devolved areas to the central state in the UK have been relatively weak in conception, and even those haven't really been exercised very much. Over the last several months, there's been some very intensive work between the Scottish administration, the Welsh administration, and David Lidington in central government, which seems to have developed a set of working practices that are more effective, although in the end it was rejected in Scotland but accepted in Wales. So without wanting to be too kind of pessimistic about the broader scene, you were talking about a kind of the equivalent of a kind of planning blight on policy in general, and we're holding up devolution in England as an area where there seemed to be more reason for optimism, and I just wonder how far that's true.
You're asking a Welshman to be optimistic, which is quite an interesting sort of question. I suppose the points that you make around asymmetry and ad hocism and all the rest of it, I mean, it does seem to me to be where you ultimately whether you think that is a good thing or a bad thing in an unideal world. I think I would start from the basis that that approach, in absence of anything that's more comprehensive, which I have no faith will come forward for a bunch of political reasons that you've alluded to, seems to make allows us to get some ways down the road between trying to resolve this long-standing question and issue. And I think there is a difference between public services more generally and then what we think about in relation to the economic side, the economic development type policies. And I think we need to be mindful of those. But I do think when we are trying to resolve this long-standing question, which is how do we reconcile the very local, as in an individual local authority, which is in most instances too small to be making, I think, decisions and around the economy of their area and how it functions. I think nearly every, even local economies, span several jurisdictions. Even that includes our biggest local authorities like Birmingham and Leeds. Their economy goes well beyond the jurisdictions, and clearly an England scale which has been ordinarily too large and has, in a sense, because we've had an England approach or a UK approach, it very much stymies local policy variation and indeed experimentation that we would expect and I would say want to see going on in places like Greater Manchester or West Midlands or London and all the rest of it. So I think I take a sort of pragmatic approach to where we are, given the long-standing nature of where we've been on some of these debates. And whilst I understand the critique that the Metro Mayor model or the devolution model that we see in England is asymmetric or ad hoc or imperfect, all of which I would agree with, at least it starts a process by which then other bigger questions can be discussed. And I think if we only ever consider them in the abstract, we will be doing that in 40 years' time in the way that we were doing it 40 years before. So imperfect, of course, but...
Just one observation on that. Through our own work on looking at local industrial strategies, which are emerging out of the national industrial strategy through the combined authorities, we've seen quite a lot of these come along recently and bidding for some, winning some, and so on. And what in relation to the Brexit debate, I mean, it was interesting to me to see that every local industrial strategy seems to have a impact of Brexit section within it. The combined authorities are keen to, but when you actually quiz them about, okay, what do you actually mean by that? Nobody really knows. It's just, we want the Brexit analysis, but we don't really know what we're asking for. maybe that reflects the national system as well, but maybe it also reflects a kind of, as you say, it's ad hoc nature of how it's all working out, and a kind of lack of thinking at the local level about what you really want to do, what you really want to analyse.
So I'm Professor Tarani from King's College. I was actually very interested in Angelica's elaboration on what kind of regulation or policy changes could be implemented after Brexit according to the city, basically. Yeah.
That's an enormous subject, so it would be difficult for me to do justice to it here in just a few minutes. I mean, certainly very happy to follow up with you afterwards as well and show you, because all of this research that we've done is in the public domain, and so I'd be very happy to point you to particular pieces of research where we go into this, and including specific policy recommendations in a lot of detail. I guess what I would say for now is that there are a few key areas that we've been focusing on, policy and regulation-wise, and these are really reflective of what the industry believes or feels to be its key priorities. So one is actually something that has come up already in the discussion today, and I think we'll be hearing more about it in due course, but it's the question of skills and talent, and of course that's also related to the immigration question, so policy around that. We are in fact launching a piece of research on Monday, which looks specifically at that question, but the key point would be a desire for continued mutual access between the UK and the EU27 of labour pools and talented workers and skilled people. And I think the other main area is this sort of big overarching umbrella area of essentially market access. So what we have called for is a bespoke future relationship agreement that delivers market access based on the idea of mutual regulatory recognition, and that also probably doesn't come as a surprise, because a lot of what I spoke about, fundamentally revolves around this issue of market access. So those are some kind of overarching key themes, but yeah, as I said, lots of specific policy recommendations that I could talk to you about as well.
Okay, thank you. There's someone in the back waving, or was someone? Okay.
Hi. So I'm Chris Mansell. I'm the Brexit policy lead for the Greater London Authority, part of the team that worked with Ben to develop the Cambridge Econometrics analysis released in January. I'm here shopping, basically. I liked your stated ambition at the beginning of the talk of trying to translate academic research in a more accessible way. One of the tasks we've been given by the Mayor and his team is trying to educate Londoners about the challenges of Brexit in a way that is accessible and easily explained. We've been thinking over the last few months about how we can best try to explain the complexities of modern trade to the average voter and try to help illuminate the challenges that Brexit poses. And I'm interested, Philip, in your work. Is there a way to translate that into a slightly more accessible fashion that demonstrates the level of current trade with the EU that could be classed as intermediary services and goods, that's slightly more complicated than just using input-output tables as a way to give a bit of flavour to communities outside of London of how much of their industries is reliant upon that? And I suppose the second question is related to the modelling of integrated supply chains and the impact that frustrations amongst across the EU-UK border would have to just-in-time production. Do we have a sense of how much just-in-time production we have in the UK, how much it would cost our larger manufacturers and industrial base to start building the necessary warehouses and processes to cope with delays? Again, shopping, open for ideas and advice is where we could look for answers to these questions.
Well, I'll take the first question. The issue about how big these things are, the trade thing. The general awareness of the public of trade issues is much lower than people realise. It's much lower than people themselves understand, because it's so much more complex. I mean, I tried to give an example that I would use with students, for example. People who are working in industry, working in professional services, in legal services, intellectual property, computer programming, people in logistics, they know this stuff because it's what they do every day. But lots of people have no idea about these things because that's not what they do in their work environment. And the other big part of the problem is many of the enterprises and firms and communities which are directly affected by these issues are not themselves exporters. This is a big part of the problem. Well, I don't export, so it's not relevant for me. Actually, no, you don't export, but you supply a local company, and that company supplies another company which also supplies Jaguar Land Rover or supplies one of the big financial services companies. These things are hidden. So it's a slightly complicated argument because there are different ways of accounting how you apportion GVA across the country. But to give orders of magnitude, the European Union, how big is the European Union economy in terms of its contribution to the UK economy? It's half the size of the London economy. It's 2/3 of the size of the economy of the southeast of England, and it's bigger than any of the large regions of the United Kingdom. So the direct demand contribution of the European Union economy to the UK is bigger than the economy of Scotland. It's bigger than the economy of the West Midlands. It's bigger than the economy even of the North West, Yorkshire or Humberside. These are huge numbers. So that's the starting point. That's a way of giving a sense of orders of magnitude that people can start to think, oh, okay, this is not a small issue. Because if you say, well, it's 45% or 48% or 50% of our exports, what does that mean? Depends on how big your exports are. Depends on how big your imports are. It doesn't really mean anything. Whereas if you say it in this sense, it gives an order of magnitude. On the just-in-time logistics one of the things that I've been reading about in the press recently is to kind of cope with restrictions then and to be able to run just in time, what kind of warehousing facilities we'll have to develop. You can't run just in time with warehousing. It's impossible. Just in time works precisely because there is no warehousing. Zero. It's not an optimal level of warehousing to have. Just in time doesn't work like that. The whole point is everything is done just in time, because that's the way you can capture all the quality and you can identify faults instantly. So you end up with, parts per million or parts per 10 million failure rates precisely because everything's done just in time. There is no warehousing in just in time. How big is just in time? It is all of the UK auto industry. It's not bits of it. Toyota, Nissan, Jaguar Land Rover, Ford, it doesn't matter who you are. The top end all work on those principles, and those things move down the supply chain. There are different logistics arrangements through the hierarchy of the supply chain, that is true, but they basically are all driven by the just-in-time demand system. And the case that, for example, David Bailey would give you would be Honda in Swindon. Has 350 shipments a day. Every shipment every day is different, and all the thousands of components in those shipments change day by day. They're coming from multiple suppliers all around Europe, depending on the demand schedule of the business, which itself is changing by the hour, by the day, as demands are coming in from dealers. That's how just-in-time works. So the idea that you have a standard component coming in with a truck with a particular number plate on it, with a particular name from A to B, this is kind of a fairy tale. So these things are significant. And in the auto industry, for the big producers, just-in-time is the only game in town. There's no plan B. In fact, there hasn't been a plan B for about 35 years. So that's the kind of scale of the issues which are at stake here.
Okay, thank you. I also remember the talk of David Bailey and others in Birmingham saying, if those trucks come from ships, 350 a day, and instead of 2 minutes, they have 4 or 6 minutes to get through those customs. There would be a queue of 45 kilometers or something. They calculated already things like that. That sounds like a severe impact to me. I don't know if in other places than Dover that also might be the case, but I think that might be the consequences. The person in the back now, who was, yeah.
It's Tony. I'm Tony Travers from the LSE. I mean, inevitably, an afternoon like this and other events at the moment are looking at the process of the UK withdrawing from the EU and the economic consequences of withdrawal. But of course, both this process and then the separate later reconnection through the trade deals are negotiated by a tiny number of people in great secrecy. They're a negotiation, and almost all of that is inaccessible to outside forces, really. I mean, because they're negotiations, they have to take place in secret, and we've seen the tortured nature of them so far, the complicated nature of how this is to be done. So against that backdrop, and given that most representations, I guess, from both sectors and areas of the UK to government boil down to don't change anything, moving ahead, any advice to any city, London today, but it could be other city regions, cannot really go further than, can it? Just be prepared for anything. Just be prepared for whatever might happen. It's hard to see how any other advice makes any sense, because we can only know what we know when we know it.
Ben, for instance, suggested some cities are more resilient than other cities. So can you say something on it?
Well, they are. I think from a planning perspective at a local level, city level, what you said is true to a point, but there needs people like some degree of certainty based around that. I mean, even if it's incredibly difficult to say so many jobs are at risk or so much output is risk or so much supply, there needs to be some kind of understanding of the processes involved so that some degree of planning and foresight can take place. Otherwise, how do you prepare for something that is so uncertain? There has to be some thinking going through that.
Work with scenarios?
Yeah, scenarios is one way. But I agree. I mean, the scenarios we did were largely constrained by previous work and the need to kind of consider soft, hard Brexit. But I agree. There's so many variants. Although given the Irish border problem is the main intractable one, there could still be huge issues there about what is actually the final agreement, which nobody really knows. It's true.
A few months ago, Andrew and I were sharing a platform at a meeting in Liverpool at the Heseltine Institute, and this kind of question came up. I think one of the big issues goes back to the points that Andrew was making earlier. Within the UK, there are enormous differences in capacity and capabilities at the institutional level. Yes, we don't know what's going to happen. And so when we've been asked questions about, okay, you've got all these results, but what do you think will actually happen? Well, the first thing we say is it depends on the outcome of the negotiations. That's not an opt-out, that's just the reality. But what we do is we try to indicate the level of exposure of places, the kind of degree of risk that different sectors and different regions and different occupational groups that we're working on at the moment face. But there are parts of the UK, and I think London would be the premier case, followed by places like Greater Manchester. Now I think the West Midlands is working hard to catch up, to try and at least think about different realities depending on what the alternative outcomes are. The Scottish case would be another one. And then trying to undertake some sort of foresight type exercises that if this was to happen, then how might we respond? What tools or levers do we have in our kind of remit, in our toolkit? What facilities do we have to, at least could we try and mitigate this? Could we try and that? The problem is there are large parts of the UK that have absolutely zero capability to do that, and they know it. There is no data. And even if there is data, the data is generally very poor. They don't have the people, they don't have the skill set. They're telephoning round other consultancies, academics and so on, saying, can you help us? Because they don't have that. And so this is also a big part of the problem, that internally the asymmetric nature of UK in terms of governance is also reflected in terms of big differences in competences and capabilities. And I think whatever's going to happen, probably places like London, followed by Manchester, West Midlands, Scotland as a whole, are probably likely to be able to respond better, as much as anything else, because they have a better institutional capacity and better reconnaissance. That would be my guess. Whereas there are many parts of the country, many towns which are struggling, which really have no systems and no capabilities to respond.
Okay, Angelique, I wanted to respond.
Yeah, if I could just kind of briefly add on to that. One of the things that we have consistently called for, which I think is really relevant to this question and this discussion, is for business to work in collaboration and partnership with regulators and with, policymakers, both at the UK level, but also at the regional and the even more, sub-regional local level. So that's been something that we've emphasized consistently, right? The importance of this kind of collaboration and partnership. But I think it's particularly relevant for this question and this discussion because, yes, the approach that an organization or an institution or a city or region might take to this question of, extreme uncertainty and the fact that, there is a negotiation process going on and, there are steps, but the final outcome won't be known for some time. The way any individual or region or organization will respond to that uncertainty is of course different, but I think the business perspective is very much one of, scenario planning and contingencies. It's of course very difficult to generalize about business. It's difficult even to generalize about financial and related professional services, but by and large one would say that, businesses would as an act of responsibility for business planning and to their shareholders and stakeholders would need to at least draw up scenarios, including worst case scenarios, contingency planning, and then wait and see how things evolve, most likely in the hope that they would not have to activate those contingency plans, because activating scenario planning and contingency planning, of course, can be disruptive, it can add additional cost. So again, as a big generalization, that's something that many businesses would prefer to avoid if at all possible. But just in terms of responsibly running a business, they would need to at least draw up those plans. But to the extent to which this kind of thinking and scenario planning can be done in collaboration with regulators and policymakers, I think that's all to the better.
Okay, thank you. The microphone is already there. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I'm not an academic. I'm not an economist. I'm a barrister. Sorry, you can now hear me. Yes. Thank you. Having listened to you all, I think it is most frightening that no politician prior to David Cameron ordering that there should be a referendum had ever done any analysis of the economic consequences to this country. You are all extremely intelligent, useful people to Britain, and I can't believe that nobody was asked to assist before he made this decision and put us in this position. And you're all talking about things done retrospectively. What I also got concerned about was that you identified the losses that this country would make, labour-wise, employment-wise, and financial. And you've also said that won't change, that there will be permanent losses. That's what I understood. And therefore, even if we start trading outside of the EU with all these countries that the government think we're going to suddenly have trade contracts with, you're saying we're going to suffer these permanent losses in employment and in financial gain. We're not going to gain, we're going to lose permanently. Is that right?
Well, maybe that refers to my notion between exposure and impact. There might be substitution, there might be other things which are still have to be explored a lot, I think. But I think no one gains from a Brexit. I think that is something I can state, but I don't know if anyone wants to react. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, in our modelling, we had to stick with largely what was known in terms of assumptions that we could put in. And one of the big unknowns is obviously what trade deals might be negotiated with other countries post-Brexit, as when the government obviously embarks on its empire version 2.0. And nobody really knows what that will look like and what kind of deals we will get, which we suffered criticism at the time we issued our report about why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that? Because there was so much uncertainty about what might be. No one really knows. What we do know, and what the models do give you, is a sense of scale of these things. And we do know that the likes of trade with India, China, other countries are dwarfed by trade with Europe. And therefore, there is no way that any new trade deals can substitute for what we'll be losing.
Yeah, Phil. And then we have one last question, Phil.
Yeah, actually from the World Impact Output database that our team uses, and I should refer, by the way, this is not my work, this is our work. This is a huge team, and the data building work is led by Mark over here and Bart, who's not here today, and Frank as well. To kind of give orders of magnitude, so for example, the Chinese economy we know is vast, but what's its contribution to the UK economy? It's about the size of the economy of Newcastle. India, you know, there's a big publicity thing about the government going to India. Again, what's the size of the Indian economy? It's something like, you know, the economy of Coventry or something like that, Bournemouth. They're just tiny numbers. Even Canada, Australia, that we have very long-standing trading, historical relationships with. Again, you're talking about places like the size of Bournemouth. So, you know, if we get a new trade deal with New Zealand, the New Zealand economy on the UK is about the size of the economy of Chesterfield or Mansfield. So even if you had 20% growth in trade, it's like a small suburb in Chesterfield. I mean, basically, they're just unobservable, the changes. So these are things that have political, symbolic importance, but in terms of fundamental economics, the likelihood is that they really have no effect. And even with the big countries in the Far East, for example, again, the numbers are, even though the economies are large, because the distance is so large, the actual interaction effects with the UK is still very small. And that's not by assumption, that's what you just see in the data.
Okay, one last question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious to know, is the reality, however, that not an awful lot is going to change as regards goods because we're going to stay in the customs union? We're going to fudge it, and so it's going to kind of go away, and it's all going to be kicked into the long grass. So although we may be worried about change that's going to happen, it probably isn't going to happen because we just stay in the customs union. It affects services, but in terms of goods, we stay in the customs union, possibly indefinitely pretty much, and life just goes on.
Answer to this?
I would say I have no idea whether we'll, you know, what will happen. But we do need to be clear that, you know, Brexit, if it happens in whatever shape or form, is adding to a fairly difficult situation that we find ourselves in the UK currently. You know, notwithstanding the lady's kind of point, you know, in a sense, look at what we've had in terms of growth since the 2008 financial crisis. We've grown, right? We've just grown really, really slowly. And all the issues associated with that have come home to roost on these sorts of politics and economics. So the question is, will we carry on? Will Brexit be kicked into the long grass? Maybe it won't. But the point that Jonathan made at the start still needs to be grappled with. We are an incredibly unequal society and economy, right? And if you live in Wakefield, right, let me tell you, life is quite different than it is if you live in London. So in a sense that Brexit, if it doesn't happen, if it happens, it makes it worse for Wakefield, that's for clear, right? It gets worse relative to London's position, that's for sure. But even if it carries on, if Brexit never happens, we've got fairly fundamental issues we need to grapple with in this country. And unfortunately, many people who live and work in London forget that, right? Because it all feels quite decent here. And actually, in many parts of the country, the status quo as we see it ain't really doing it for them, right? So, you know, this point, I'm not suggesting you're making this point, but let's be clear that Brexit is another thing that adds to a difficult situation. And whether it does or doesn't happen, there are difficult situations to resolve.
No, I mean, just to give it, I think going back to Jonathan's point, 47% of the UK today live in regions whose productivity, so it's the best measure of prosperity, is no better than the poorest parts of the former East Germany. Think about that. 47% of the UK today live in areas which are as poor as the poorest parts of the former East Germany. More than half the UK lives in areas which are poorer than the US state of Mississippi. That's what we're talking about. The productivity variations in the UK, doesn't matter how you measure them, are as big as the whole of the Eurozone. That was also confirming what Jonathan said. And this is the underlying problem. What's going to happen after Brexit? How are we going to resolve those problems? They're not going to go away. Much of the evidence suggests they're going to get a lot worse. So there needs to be a rethink at a national level, at a governance level, about how we're going to respond. Is Brexit going to trigger that rethink? Possibly, but maybe not. I don't know, because we don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, and with this happy realization, we go into the break. I thank you very much for all your participation, and I thank the 4 panelists for their expert opinions. And see you after the break.